The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge as Elena Martinez adjusted the warm shawl around her shoulders. The Arizona Territory heat was already building, promising another scorching day, but she pulled the faded fabric tighter anyway. Not against the cold, but against the stares she knew would follow her every step. Her calloused hands gripped the small leather pouch containing what little money she had left. $3.47. It had to be enough for flour, coffee, and perhaps some salt pork, if Hutchins was feeling generous with his prices today. She doubted it. The bell above Morrison's general store chimed as she pushed through the door, the sound seeming louder and more accusatory than it had any right to be. The conversations inside died instantly. Mrs. Caldwell, the banker's wife, clutched her reticule closer and whispered something to Mrs. Henley behind her gloved hand. Two cowboys lounging by the pickle barrel straightened up, their eyes following Elena's movements with undisguised contempt. "Well, well," drawled Jeremiah Morrison from behind his counter, not bothering to look up from his ledger. "Look what the wind blew in. The Mexican widow herself." Elena's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I need supplies, Mr. Morrison. Flour, coffee, and whatever salt pork you can spare." Morrison finally raised his head, his pale eyes raking over her patched dress and worn boots. "Can you pay for it? Last I heard, that pathetic excuse for a ranch of yours wasn't bringing in much." Heat crept up Elena's neck, but she maintained her dignity. "I have money. Do you now?" One of the cowboys, a lanky man with tobacco-stained teeth, sauntered closer. "Heard tell you been selling off your husband's tools." "What's next, woman? Gonna sell yourself to keep that place running?" The store erupted in cruel laughter. Mrs. Caldwell gasped in mock horror while secretly relishing the drama. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she placed her pouch on the counter, the coins inside making a pitiful rattling sound. "Just the supplies, please," she said quietly. Morrison made a show of weighing out the flour with exaggerated slowness, shaking his head theatrically. "You know, Elena, your poor departed husband, God rest his soul, he was at least half civilized, but you—" He clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "Mexican blood always shows, doesn't it? Wild and unpredictable, just like your people." "My husband was a good man," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sure he was, till he got careless in that mine shaft. Some folks say maybe he was looking for a way out of his situation." Morrison's meaning was clear, and the renewed laughter cut through Eleanor like broken glass. Standing in the doorway, having entered as silently as morning mist, was a tall Apache man. His long black hair was braided with leather strips, and he wore a mixture of traditional buckskin and army-issued clothing, the mark of a scout. His dark eyes took in the scene with calm assessment, noting Elena's rigid posture, the tears she was fighting back, and the ugly pleasure on the faces of the white townspeople. Standing Bear had come to town to collect his pay from the army post, but now he found himself witnessing something far more important than money. He recognized the woman. He'd seen her from a distance, working alone on her small ranch, trying to keep cattle that were too few and land that was too harsh. He'd also heard the talk about her, the cruel speculation about her mixed heritage and her struggles. Morrison was still pontificating, enjoying his audience. "Course, I suppose we should show Christian charity. After all, we're civilized folks, unlike some around here." His eyes flicked momentarily to Standing Bear before returning to Elena. "Tell you what, Senora, I'll let you have these supplies for, let's say, $5. That's practically giving them away." Elena's face went white. $5 was more than she had, and Morrison knew it. The humiliation was complete. She would have to leave empty-handed, providing entertainment for these people who seemed to feed on others' misery. I don't have $5, she admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. "Well then," Morrison said with false sympathy, "I guess you'll just have to do without. Maybe if you'd married one of your own kind instead of tricking a decent white man, you wouldn't be in this fix." The cruel laughter reached a crescendo, and Elena felt something break inside her chest. She reached for her pouch with shaking hands, preparing to leave with nothing but her wounded pride. That's when Standing Bear stepped forward, his moccasined feet making no sound on the wooden floor. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, and suddenly the laughter died as the townspeople became aware of his presence. He placed a $5 gold piece on the counter with quiet authority. "For the ladies' supplies," he said simply, his English precise and unaccented. The store fell into stunned silence. Morrison's face flushed red as he stared at the gold coin, then up at Standing Bear's impassive features. The Apache warrior stood perfectly still, but there was something in his dark eyes that made the store owner's bluster die in his throat. Well, I suppose, Morrison stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under the desert sun. The two cowboys who had been so eager to humiliate Elena now shuffled their feet nervously. One whispered to his companion, "Ain't that the Apache scout, the one who tracked down them rustlers last month?" Elena turned to look at her unexpected benefactor, her brown eyes wide with surprise and something approaching gratitude. She had never seen him this close before. His face was weathered but strong, with high cheekbones and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. There was a quiet dignity about him that contrasted sharply with the crude behavior she had just endured. "You don't need to," she began, but Standing Bear shook his head slightly. "It is done," he said simply. Morrison reluctantly gathered the supplies, his movements jerky with suppressed anger. Mrs. Caldwell and Mrs. Henley had pressed themselves against the far wall, whispering furiously about the impropriety of the situation. The banker's wife kept glancing between Elena and Standing Bear, as if trying to solve a puzzle that offended her sensibilities. "There!" Morrison slammed the flour sack down harder than necessary. $5 worth. He snatched up the gold piece as if it might bite him. Standing Bear nodded once and stepped aside, indicating that Elena should collect her purchases. As she gathered the precious supplies, her fingers brushing against the rough burlap of the flour sack, she felt a mixture of relief and humiliation. Relief that she wouldn't go home empty-handed, humiliation that she had needed charity, and from someone the townspeople considered even lower than herself. "Thank you," she whispered as she passed him. But Standing Bear gave no indication he had heard. Elena hurried toward the door, desperate to escape the stifling atmosphere of judgment and hatred. But as she reached for the handle, Morrison's voice stopped her cold. "Don't think this changes anything, Senora. You're still not welcome here. And you," he pointed a thick finger at Standing Bear, "don't think your army connections will protect you if you start getting ideas above your station." Standing Bear turned slowly to face the store owner. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I think only of what is right." The two men stared at each other across the cluttered store, the tension thick as smoke. Finally, Morrison looked away first, busying himself with rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, and the dusty street shimmered with heat waves. Elena loaded her supplies into her rickety wagon with hands that still trembled slightly. She was painfully aware that Standing Bear had followed her out and was watching her struggle with the heavy flour sack. "Let me," he said, stepping forward to lift the sack effortlessly into the wagon bed. "I can manage," Elena said automatically, then immediately regretted her tone. This man had just saved her from complete humiliation, and here she was snapping at him like a cornered animal. "I know you can," Standing Bear replied without offense, "but there is no shame in accepting help when it is freely given." Elena studied his face, looking for mockery or pity, but found neither. Instead, she saw something that had been absent from every other interaction she'd had in this town: simple human respect. "Why did you do that?" she asked quietly. "Those people in there, they hate me, but they fear you. You could have just walked away." Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, his gaze traveling down the dusty street to where a group of men had gathered outside the saloon, their hostile stares fixed on the unlikely pair. "My grandfather once told me that a person's worth is not measured by the color of their skin or the blood in their veins, but by the strength of their spirit. I have watched you work your land alone. I have seen your spirit." The simple words hit Elena harder than all of Morrison's cruelty combined. When had anyone last spoken to her with such straightforward honesty? When had anyone last seen her as more than a burden, a curiosity, or an object of scorn? "I don't know how I can repay you," she said. "There is no debt," Standing Bear replied. "But," he hesitated, then continued, "the men who gather at the saloon, they speak of your ranch. They say the bank holds papers on your land." Eleanor's face went pale. She had hoped her financial troubles weren't common knowledge, but apparently there were no secrets in Copper Ridge. "Mr. Caldwell has been patient, but patience has limits." "How long?" 2 months. Maybe less if I can't make the next payment." Standing Bear nodded thoughtfully. "There is work for those who are not afraid of it. The army needs supplies, beef, horses, grain, but they pay only those they trust." "They would never trust someone like me," Elena said bitterly. "They trust me," Standing Bear said simply, "and I would speak for you." Elena stared at him in amazement. Here was a man who barely knew her, offering help that could mean the difference between keeping her home and losing everything. In a world where everyone seemed determined to watch her fail, he was offering her a chance to succeed. "Why?" she whispered. Standing Bear's eyes met hers steadily. "Because sometimes the right thing is also the hardest thing. And because—" he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because I understand what it means to stand between two worlds and belong fully to neither." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. 3 riders were coming down the street, the sheriff and 2 deputies, their faces grim with purpose. Sheriff Nathaniel Crenshaw reined in his horse just a few feet from where Eleanor and Standing Bear stood beside her wagon. The lawman's weathered face was set in hard lines, his pale blue eyes cold as winter frost. Behind him, Deputies Mills and Rodriguez flanked him like hunting hounds awaiting their master's command. "Well, well," Crenshaw drawled, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt. "What do we have here? The grieving widow and her new friend." Elena felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. Sheriff Crenshaw had never made any secret of his disdain for anyone who wasn't pure Anglo stock, and his attitude toward her had grown noticeably worse since her husband's death had left her without a man's protection. "Good morning, Sheriff," she managed, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Standing Bear remained perfectly still, but Elena could sense the coiled tension in him, like a mountain cat preparing to spring. His dark eyes never left Crenshaw's face, reading every micro-expression with the skill of a man who had learned to survive by understanding his enemies. "Heard there was some kind of disturbance in Morrison's store," Crenshaw continued, swinging down from his saddle with deliberate slowness. "Something about charity being handed out to folks who maybe don't deserve it." "I bought supplies," Elena said firmly. "There was no disturbance." "Is that right?" The sheriff's gaze shifted to Standing Bear. "And what's your version, Apache? You just happened to be throwing gold around for no good reason?" "I paid for supplies," Standing Bear replied calmly. "It is not against your law." Deputy Mills, a nervous young man with a sparse mustache, leaned forward in his saddle. "Maybe not, but it sure is curious. Indian scout helping out a Mexican widow. Folks might start to wonder what kind of arrangement you two got going." The insinuation hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Elena's face burned with shame and anger, but she forced herself to remain silent. Any protest would only make things worse. "That's enough, Mills," Crenshaw said, but his tone suggested he approved of his deputy's crude suggestion. "Still, it does raise questions. See, we've had some reports of missing livestock, cattle disappearing from ranches north of town, and it's funny how these things seem to happen when certain elements are moving around freely." Standing Bear's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You accuse me of theft?" "I'm not accusing anybody of anything, yet." Crenshaw stepped closer, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate the Apache warrior. "But I'm keeping my eyes open, and I'm wondering if maybe some folks are getting help from people who know the country real well, people who might know all the hidden trails and water holes." Elena couldn't stay silent any longer. "Standing Bear serves as a scout for the army. His reputation is his business," Crenshaw cut her off sharply. "But yours is mine. A woman in your situation needs to be careful about the company she keeps. Wouldn't want folks to get the wrong idea about how you're managing to keep that ranch of yours running." The threat was clear. In a town where reputation meant everything, the sheriff was warning Elena that associating with Standing Bear would only make her already precarious position worse. Deputy Rodriguez, a heavy-set man with cold eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to Standing Bear's moccasins. "Maybe the Apache here thinks he's white because he wears army clothes, but we know better, don't we, Sheriff?" "We surely do," Crenshaw agreed. "Blood tells, doesn't it? And Apache blood. Well, that's got raiding and stealing bred right into it." Standing Bear's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the knife at his belt, then stopped. Eleanor saw the moment of choice, the split second where violence hung balanced on a razor's edge. But the Apache warrior's iron control held firm. "I have stolen nothing," he said quietly, "and I will not be accused by men who know nothing of honor." The word honor seemed to strike Crenshaw like a physical blow. His face reddened, and his hand dropped to his gun. "You got something to say about my honor, Redskin?" Eleanor stepped forward without thinking, placing herself partially between the two men. "Please, Sheriff, there's no need for trouble. I was just buying supplies, and this man was kind enough to help when I was short of funds, nothing more." Crenshaw's eyes flicked between Eleanor and Standing Bear, calculating. The main street was beginning to fill with curious onlookers, drawn by the obvious tension. Morrison stood in his store doorway, clearly enjoying the drama. Mrs. Caldwell and several other women had gathered on the boardwalk, whispering behind their fans. "Kind enough to help," Crenshaw repeated mockingly. "How touching. But kindness between your kind and his kind has a way of leading to trouble, the kind of trouble this town doesn't need." He stepped back and remounted his horse, but his eyes never left Standing Bear. "I'll be watching, Apache, both of you, and if even one more head of cattle goes missing, I'll know where to look first." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his deputies following like loyal dogs. But the damage was done. The confrontation had been public, witnessed by half the town. Elena knew that by nightfall, everyone in Copper Ridge would be talking about the Mexican widow and her Apache protector. Standing Bear watched the lawmen disappear around a corner before turning back to Elena. "You should not have stepped between us," he said quietly. "You were going to do something foolish," Elena replied. "Perhaps, but now you have made an enemy of the sheriff. That is dangerous for someone in your position." Elena looked around at the gathered townspeople, noting the hostile stares and whispered conversations. Standing Bear was right. She had just made her situation infinitely worse, but somehow she didn't regret it. "Maybe," she said, "but some things are worth the risk." As if summoned by their conversation, Banker Caldwell emerged from his office across the street, his pale face stern with disapproval. He marched directly toward Elena, his polished boots clicking authoritatively on the wooden boardwalk. "Mrs. Martinez," he called out formally, "I need to speak with you. About your account." Elena's heart sank. The confrontation with the sheriff had been bad enough, but she knew that whatever Caldwell had to say would be worse. Banker Caldwell approached with the measured stride of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. His wife scurried behind him, her earlier gossip forgotten in the face of serious business. Elena's hands instinctively tightened on the wagon's wooden rail as she prepared for the worst. "Mrs. Martinez," Caldwell began, his voice carrying the weight of financial authority, "I'm afraid recent events have forced me to reconsider the terms of your loan arrangement." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Caldwell continued, adjusting his spectacles with bureaucratic precision, "that your association with certain undesirable elements has raised concerns among my other clients. They question the wisdom of extending further credit to someone who demonstrates such poor judgment in choosing companions." Standing Bear remained silent, but Elena could feel the controlled fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. She knew that one wrong word from Caldwell could spark violence that would destroy them both. "My loan payments have been current," Elena said desperately. "I've never missed." "Until now," Caldwell interrupted smoothly. "Your payment was due 3 days ago, and given the irregularities in your recent behavior, I'm afraid I can no longer offer the flexibility I once did." Elena's world tilted. 3 days ago. She had been so focused on scraping together money for supplies that she had lost track of the payment schedule. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "I can have the money by tomorrow," she said quickly. "I just need 1 more day." Caldwell shook his head with false regret. "I'm afraid that's no longer possible. The board has voted to call in your loan immediately. You have 48 hours to settle your debt in full, or the bank will be forced to foreclose on your property." The words echoed in Elena's ears like gunshots. 48 hours. She couldn't raise that much money in 48 days, let alone 48 hours. Her ranch, her home, everything her husband had worked for, gone. "That's impossible," she whispered. "You know I don't have that kind of money." "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before making a public spectacle of yourself," Mrs. Caldwell interjected sharply. "Decent women don't associate with savages." Standing Bear stepped forward, his movement fluid and dangerous. "Careful with your words, woman." Mrs. Caldwell shrank back, but her husband puffed out his chest with borrowed authority. "Are you threatening my wife, Indian?" "I am stating a fact," Standing Bear replied calmly. "Words have consequences. Choose yours wisely." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, sensing drama. Elena could see Morrison grinning from his doorway, clearly delighted by her downfall. The 2 cowboys who had mocked her earlier stood nearby, making crude comments about her predicament. "How much?" Standing Bear asked suddenly. Caldwell blinked in confusion. "I beg your pardon?" "The debt. How much money does she owe?" "That's hardly your concern," Caldwell sputtered. "How much?" Standing Bear repeated, his voice carrying quiet menace. Eleanor watched in amazement as the pompous banker actually took a step backward. There was something in Standing Bear's tone that suggested he was not a man to be trifled with. $237. Caldwell admitted reluctantly. Plus interest and fees, of course. Standing Bear nodded slowly. I will pay it. The crowd fell silent. Even Morrison stopped grinning. Elena stared at the Apache warrior in shock. You can't, she breathed. That's too much money. I have it, Standing Bear said simply. Caldwell's face cycled through several emotions: surprise, calculation, and finally suspicion. Where would someone like you get that kind of money? Army pay, scout wages, bounties for captured outlaws. Standing Bear's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. I do not spend much. I save. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. This man, who barely knew her, was offering to sacrifice what must be years of careful savings to help her keep her home. It was too much. She couldn't accept such generosity. No, she said firmly. I won't let you do this. It's your money, your future. Standing Bear turned to look at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something vulnerable in his dark eyes. I have no future, he said quietly. My people are scattered. My world is ending. But you still fight? You still hope? That is worth preserving. Before Elena could protest further, Standing Bear strode purposefully toward the bank. Caldwell hurried after him, clearly torn between his desire to refuse the Apache's money and his banker's instinct to collect a debt. The crowd followed, drawn by morbid curiosity and the unprecedented nature of the situation. Elena found herself swept along, still reeling from the rapid turn of events. Inside the bank, Standing Bear produced a leather pouch from inside his shirt. He counted out gold coins with methodical precision, the metal clinking against the marble counter like a funeral bell. Caldwell watched each coin with hungry eyes, his principles warring with his greed. $250, Standing Bear announced. More than enough. Caldwell's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the money. This is highly irregular, but legal, Standing Bear pointed out. Unless you wish to explain to the territorial governor why you refused lawful payment to satisfy a debt. The threat was subtle but effective. Caldwell knew that refusing the money would raise questions he couldn't answer without revealing his own prejudices. Reluctantly, he began preparing the necessary paperwork. Elena watched in numb amazement as her debt was erased with the scratch of a pen. She was free, but at what cost? Standing Bear had just given up everything for her, a woman he barely knew, whose troubles were not his responsibility. As they left the bank, the crowd dispersed slowly, disappointed that there had been no violence or further drama. Elena walked beside Standing Bear in silence, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. I'll pay you back, she finally managed. Every cent. I swear it. Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment. There is no debt between us, he said finally. But if you truly wish to repay me, then succeed. Make your ranch profitable. Show these people that they were wrong about you. Elena nodded, tears streaming freely down her cheeks now. Why did you do this? Really? Standing Bear stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Because in a world that seems determined to destroy everything good and decent, sometimes we must choose to build instead of tear down. Sometimes we must choose hope over fear. The simple words carried the weight of profound truth. Elena understood that she had just witnessed something rare and precious, an act of pure human kindness that transcended all boundaries of race and culture. 3 months had passed since that fateful day at Morrison's general store, and the Arizona landscape had begun its subtle transition toward winter. The morning air carried a crisp edge that promised cooler days ahead, and Elena Martinez stood on the porch of her ranch house, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Her ranch was transformed. Where once there had been only struggling cattle and neglected fences, now there were sturdy corrals and well-fed livestock. The army contract that Standing Bear had helped her secure had proven more valuable than gold, providing steady income and respectability. But more than that, it had given her something she had almost lost: hope. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the trail that wound down from the hills. Standing Bear emerged from the morning shadows, leading a string of horses toward the ranch. He had taken to stopping by regularly, ostensibly to check on the horses he was training for the army, but Elena suspected there were deeper reasons for his visits. "Good morning," she called out as he approached. "Good morning," he replied, swinging down from his mount with fluid grace. "The army horses are ready for delivery. Captain Morrison says they are the finest he has seen." Elena smiled at the formal way he still spoke to her, despite the months of growing friendship. Captain Morrison is not related to our friend at the general store, I hope? No relation, Standing Bear confirmed, and Elena was pleased to see the hint of humor in his dark eyes. It had taken weeks for him to begin showing emotion in her presence, but gradually the walls had come down. They worked together in comfortable silence, checking the horses and preparing them for transport. It was a partnership that had developed naturally. Elena's business sense combined with Standing Bear's knowledge of horses and the military's needs. What had begun as charity had evolved into something far more valuable: mutual respect and shared purpose. "Elena," Standing Bear said as they finished their inspection, "there is something I must tell you." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. "What is it?" "The army is moving me to Fort Apache. They say my skills are needed there." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I leave in 1 week." Elena felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. In the months since Standing Bear had saved her ranch, she had grown to depend not just on his business partnership, but on his steady presence. He had become her anchor in a world that still viewed her with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. "For how long?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Permanently. The Apache reservation needs scouts who understand both worlds." He looked directly at her. "It is important work." Elena nodded, understanding the weight of what he was telling her. Standing Bear was being called to help his own people navigate the difficult transition to reservation life. It was honorable work, necessary work, and it would take him away from her. "Of course you must go," she said. "Your people need you." "Yes," he agreed quietly, "but I find that leaving is difficult." The admission hung between them like morning mist, fragile and precious. Elena felt her heart skip, but forced herself to think practically. What future could there be for them? A Mexican widow and an Apache warrior. The world would never accept such a union. As if reading her thoughts, Standing Bear continued, "I know what you are thinking. I know the obstacles we would face, but I also know that what has grown between us is rare and valuable." Elena looked away, struggling with emotions she had tried to keep buried. "The town has finally begun to accept me as a legitimate businesswoman. If there were anything between us, all that progress would disappear. Would it matter?" Standing Bear asked simply. "Their acceptance comes with conditions. It can be withdrawn at any time for any reason. Is that really acceptance at all?" Elena considered his words. He was right, of course. Her newfound respectability was built on a foundation of sand. One misstep, one act that offended the town's sensibilities, and she would be back where she started, or worse. "What are you asking of me?" she said finally. Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, watching the horses graze in the morning sun. "I am asking you to consider that there might be something more important than their approval, something worth the risk." Before Elena could respond, the sound of multiple riders approaching interrupted their conversation. Sheriff Crenshaw and 3 deputies appeared on the trail, riding hard toward the ranch. Elena's stomach clenched with familiar dread. "Mrs. Martinez," Crenshaw called out as he reined in his horse. "We need to talk to your friend here." Standing Bear stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Elena and the lawmen. "What do you want, Sheriff?" "Got reports of rustled cattle from the Henderson spread. Witnesses say they saw an Apache matching your description in the area." Crenshaw's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who believed he finally had the evidence he needed. "What witnesses?" Standing Bear asked calmly. "Reliable ones. White men with no reason to lie." Crenshaw dismounted, his hand resting on his gun. "You're coming with us for questioning." Elena stepped forward. "He was here yesterday, all day. I can vouch for him." Crenshaw's laugh was harsh. "Your word isn't worth much, Senora. Everyone knows you'd say anything to protect your business partner." The insinuation was clear and insulting. Elena felt her temper flare, but Standing Bear caught her eye and shook his head slightly. He was right. Any protest would only make things worse. "I will come," Standing Bear said quietly, "but I have done nothing wrong." "We'll see about that," Crenshaw replied. "Mount up." As Standing Bear prepared to leave with the sheriff, Elena made a decision that surprised even herself. "Sheriff Crenshaw," she called out, "before you take him, you should know that Standing Bear and I are to be married." The words rang out clear and strong, and their effect was immediate. Crenshaw's face went white with shock, then red with outrage. The deputies muttered among themselves, clearly disturbed by this unexpected development. Standing Bear turned to stare at Elena in amazement. She met his gaze steadily, her chin raised in defiance of the world's disapproval. "Married?" Crenshaw sputtered. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious," Elena replied. which means he is about to become my husband. And I think Judge Morrison would be very interested to hear how you're harassing a respectable rancher's fiancé without any real evidence. It was a masterful stroke. Judge Morrison, unlike his merchant brother, was known for his fairness and his strict adherence to the law. More importantly, he was Elena's customer. She supplied beef to his household regularly. Crenshaw found himself caught in a legal and political trap. Arresting Standing Bear now would mean explaining his actions to a judge who wouldn't appreciate harassment based on prejudice rather than evidence. "This isn't over," Crenshaw warned as he remounted his horse. "Marriage or no marriage, I'll be watching." After the lawmen departed, Eleanor and Standing Bear stood in the sudden quiet of the morning, both aware that everything had changed with her impulsive declaration. "Did you mean it?" Standing Bear asked quietly. Elena looked at him. This man who had sacrificed everything for her, who had shown her what real honor looked like, who had given her back not just her ranch but her dignity. The answer came from somewhere deeper than thought. "Yes," she said simply. "If you'll have me." Standing Bear's usual stoic expression cracked, revealing a smile that transformed his entire face. "Then we will face whatever comes together." As they stood on the porch of Elena's ranch, looking out over the land they had saved together, both understood that they were embarking on a path that would never be easy. The world would not approve of their union. They would face hatred, suspicion, and countless obstacles, but they would face them together. Two people who had found in each other something worth fighting for. In a world determined to divide, they had chosen to unite. In a time of hatred, they had chosen love. The morning sun climbed higher, painting their future in shades of possibility.